Well, I'm delighted to welcome the person, and you might not know this is what the intro that I'm going to give you, David, but the person that was described to me as the nicest person in innovation, author, speaker, innovation coach, David Bland, to the show. David, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to be the Bob Ross of innovation. That's kind of what I'm going for. So that's good. That's
There
good.
we
You
go.
referred that way.
It's working. It's working out really well. Any prizes for guessing who that might have been that said that?
Oh, no, actually, I have no idea who might say that.
Okay. It was a good friend of ours, Nick Himo. So shout out to Nick. And I just actually saw that he posted something about when he first met you a couple of years ago today on LinkedIn. So
Yeah, that was the last giant. So the book launched, Testing Business Ideas launched late 2019. And so one of the big first masterclasses we did was in Shoreditch early 2020. And of course, everything happened after that. I was flying back to SFO and everything was getting locked down here in California. But it was great to meet him there. And I had a blast. That was such a great workshop. We kicked people out of the building to go interview on the streets and everything. It was a bit cold at the time in Shoreditch, I believe. But
I remember seeing those
great.
pictures. I thought that was awesome. Yeah, so good. Hey, look, we're going to get into the book and we'll get into a whole load of other things as well. But I know that you've been in this world of innovation. You're best known, of course, for writing Testing Business Ideas with Alex Osterwalder, the Strategyzer book. It's literally like my most referenced book. I think it's probably the book that I recommend the most to anyone that I'm working with, and it's a book that I'm constantly referring to. So firstly, thank you for creating such a masterpiece, in my opinion, and I'm sure many people agree with me as well. But I want to know a little bit about David Bland before the book. And I know that you've been in this world of innovation for so long, an early kind of lean startup advocate. Tell us a little bit about that kind of earlier kind of journey into innovation, etc.
Yeah, I initially went to school for design, and in design school, I kind of got pulled into the whole .com startup. So dating myself a little bit, but back in the late '90s, everybody was going to retire on their own island by like 2002 or so. It was a really interesting time to be in tech. I have to say the timing of a lot of those startups was just terrible. I mean, the infrastructure wasn't there, the social norms weren't there, the trust wasn't there for online purchases. And it's really fascinating to me to see all these like newer startups today kind of be very reminiscent of the startups I saw around me in late 90s and just have better timing and everything. So the timing is so much of it. But the first startup I was at, we thought we were a B2C company, and we ended up pivoting to a B2B, and that's when we were really successful. And I was there almost 8 years. And so just that journey, like growing up in a startup, I learned about a lot what not to do and everything, and definitely a lot of uncertainty through that whole startup. And then I went to join a couple other startups, and they didn't do so well at all. And it was about the third startup. I was carrying my stuff out in a cardboard box and thinking, what am I going to do, after this one? I like to go home to my family with my stuff in a box. It's not a good experience. And, I actually had made some friends in consulting and everything over the years because I'd go to these conferences and speak like what I'm doing at startups, which mostly startups don't do. You're so busy at the startup that you don't make time or extra time to go do that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, let's try this coaching thing, And so I moved out to the Bay Area in San Francisco, just outside San Francisco. It was a short BART train into downtown. And, I just tried to really convey what I learned at startups at bigger companies who were working on something new. They weren't really sure how to do it, a lot of uncertainty. And it kind of just clicked for me. I had a knack for explaining really complex things in ways where people could get it and align and make progress. And I just ran with it. And so that was around 2010 or 11. And fast forward to today, I've just had, a really amazing experience and kind of built a really, really enjoyable career for myself on trying to help people deal with uncertainty. So it's been a really winding journey, but it's been really fun.
Yeah, amazing. I love that kind of, it's almost that paradox of the widening journey, but also it's been fairly concentrated on helping people deal with uncertainty, on testing, on experimentation, on those kind of principles from things like Lean Startup or of, your book and maybe design thinking practice, all those kind of things kind of woven in from what I'm seeing of your work. I remember some of your stuff around, the assumption mapping as those kind of tools and some of those really amazing bits of content around things like the product death cycle that you've kind of seem to have become quite famous for, I think, as well, which is pretty awesome. But fairly wide, but also, I guess, really focusing on those challenging areas of really understanding what it is that users are really looking for, how they can kind of solve those challenges for them, and navigating that uncertainty. So yeah, amazing.
Yeah, I think at the first startup, what I learned was we had a customer, and I would spend nights and weekends living at my desk, like really, like not a healthy work-life balance at all, to the detriment of all my personal relationships, like building stuff. And the customer always went to a financial advisor to make a purchase. And it didn't matter how many tools I gave your average consumer, they weren't going to be paying for the thing. Like, and so there was this kind of aha moment where like, oh, well, maybe like the actual financial advisor is our customer. And so we had to strip away all this stuff I spent nights and weekends building, and we didn't call it a pivot back then, right? And we went after this other segment, and that's when we got traction. And so kind of experiencing the opposite at the other startups where we just kept persevering no matter what. It's like, oh, that customer doesn't know what they're talking about. Let's just keep building and making this really awesome because we know it's the right thing, It just really kind of humbled me a lot. And so when I was trying to teach this, and I became an early adopter of like lean startup practices and design thinking and business model innovation, all these things I felt like fit really well together. I was really just trying to convey, from my own personal experiences, like, let's make better mistakes this time around, like learn from what I did and learn to understand the customer a bit more and not just like persevere ahead. And so I think that's why this stuff is so passionate. Like I'm so passionate about it is I personally lived it at a few startups, and I want to help other people understand like how to see these telltale signs of whether they're on the right track or not.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we're both in the world to some degree of teaching from the perspective of like helping people improve their practices and what they're doing in their lives and whatever else. But actually there's, probably no better way of learning than going through some of these challenges yourself, of hitting that roadblock, of realizing there's something different that's got to happen, figuring out some alternative approaches, different audience segments or whatever else, like you've talked about there with the B2C to B2B switch. But yeah, that's a really tough thing to put people into a position of. And I think quite often, or for people to put themselves into the position of, and I think sometimes people are quite fearful of going through that validation process of experimenting because of fear of failure and because we've got this stigma of failure so often as well. What's your perception or your belief around maybe the word failure, or how we need to kind of change our mindset around failure?
Yeah, I shared this picture on Twitter the other day. I think it was also on maybe LinkedIn as well, which was a bunch of entrepreneurs. I was going to Silicon Valley to teach a bunch of entrepreneurs business modeling, essentially. And the previous speaker had asked them to draw failure, and they were showing it to me. They had a big wall and all the sticky notes, and it was really interesting, the response when I shared that picture online, because some people are like, whoa, that's a really negative idea of failure, what they were writing there and what's the context and everything. And I think you have people that it feels as if it's a career limiting move in a way, especially outside of the Valley, right? Like in the Valley, it feels almost the opposite, where you crater your company and people just throw more money at you. It's really kind of bizarre. But when I go to Europe and other places, it feels as if, if this doesn't succeed, I'll never get funding again, is the vibe. Right. And so when you think of failure in even big companies, it's, I might not get a promotion if this fails. And so I try to like make the numbers look like it's succeeding and better than it really is. And, it's all the tricks of, it's cumulative users, and that number always goes up to the right, and things like that. And I feel as if, a lot of the tools we're teaching, these canvases and maps and everything, it's not that people can't learn the tools or even if they can't do the tool. It's more of the underlying fear, like you mentioned, behind using the tools of, I'm going to look stupid if I do, or my boss is going to think I'm stupid, or I'm not going to get a raise, or I'm not going to get promoted, or I might get fired, or like I'm looking like I'm losing money for the company. There's all this emotional stuff that's swirling behind these tools. And I think, we have to be careful as practitioners when we go in with the tools. Like I'm working with people who are some of the smartest people in the world in their field, and they were A+ students in school, and they transitioned that mentality to business. And I write about this a little bit in the book, which is if you're always incentivized for being right, and then you have someone come in and says, it's okay to be wrong, they almost don't know how to even grasp what you're saying. Like, no, it's not
Yeah.
okay for me being wrong. I've always been right. And so there's a lot of unpacking to do there when we go in to work with people, because you just can't throw tools in front of them and expect them to say, oh, it's okay if you get it wrong. It's almost like they freeze up.
Yeah, I see it so often, like yourself, and I think the frustrating thing for me is often that actually if they embrace these tools, these approaches much earlier, then the risk of bigger failures is so much more reduced. It's almost like taking out an insurance premium on, your future in some ways, or the product that you're looking to create, or whatever it is, your status. It made me think of what you were just talking about there, of perhaps what the job to be done, if you like, is of our learnings, our books, our kind of content that we're creating and things, is actually to give people just a little bit less fear in order to just really the big challenge for people is like to embrace that learning, to embrace the opportunity to fail quickly and smoothly and without pain, without too much pain, as much as possible. I'm interested as well, by the way, just kind of closing off this chapter of like pre-book, I guess. One of the things that I found, and I remember reading Lean Startup probably a couple of years, in all honesty, after it kind of was released, and just being blown away by it. And as I used it more, as I got more and more familiar and started to use it in practice, started to notice that actually some of the things that Eric did an amazing job of creating in the first place might not be the right way to go about things. And I think we share this belief around the build, measure, learn cycle, which, should actually be everything should start with learning. I'm interested to know if you've got any other thoughts on how, 10, 12 years on from Lean Startup, how your practice may have evolved, and anything that kind of you're looking at now and thinking maybe there's a different approach that we're doing now that might not be captured quite fully in kind of Lean and et cetera.
Yeah. Well, first off, I think it's easy to kind of pick apart what Eric
Sure.
did. I was following what he was doing in Startup Lessons Learned blog and Lean Startup Circles and all this stuff. And it's one of the reasons I was really drawn to it. Is I felt like it was almost like theory of relativity, like ideas of just the simplicity of just talking about it and how we can go through and managing uncertainty. So I think it's a really groundbreaking piece of work. I remember him being asked about, like, why didn't you put any failed companies in there? And he's like, just wait, you're going to see which ones failed. Like, we don't know which ones have failed yet.
Right.
So I think when we push this idea forward to 10 years, right? This has been almost or over 10 years at this point. I think what I've seen in my practice is just maybe it's a little more maturity, or just even myself as I've changed over the last decade. I'm less, and I've never really felt on board with some of the tactics that maybe that aren't like explicitly defined in the book, but are sort of embraced by that community, right? So examples like fake testimonials on your landing page. It's like, oh, how do I get people to trust what I'm working on? Well, let's just put up a bunch of made up things to make them trust us. Some people feel as if that's like a perfectly legitimate thing to do, right? They'll say, oh, we've been featured in all these different magazines, and they haven't, but they put it there to get enough trust to get people to click. And I wonder about this idea of manipulation, and especially in this day and age where a lot of stuff's been weaponized, right? And so we've seen it used against governments and everything else, like some of these techniques. And so I'm just much more mindful of that, Like when I used to run this Lean Startup meetup in San Francisco, and people would tell stories about what they're doing, and I was like, ooh, it's like, you're doing that? Like, that doesn't feel right to me, And so I think what's happened over the years is I've been pulled more into the social science aspects of this, and the idea of testing with and not on your customer. And so even when I was writing the book, my thinking was, ooh, do I include this in there or not? And do I want to give this a platform or not? And I had to make some decisions with Alex, going through that process. And so I would say the biggest thing for me has been a lot of the techniques and just this idea of testing with and not on. I'm really trying to push, especially my B2B customers, more into like a co-creation kind of thing versus let's try to deceive the customer into clicking to see if there's something there. I know it's not like a binary thing, but I feel like you're on a spectrum of, I don't want to waste all my time and money building something nobody wants. But at the same time, I don't want to deceive my customers to the point where I'm not at a stage where I'm really at, just to to check the box to move forward. And so that has been something I've always really struggled with in my career and even in my coaching.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've seen a couple of big examples where there's just vaporware. Really, there's nothing behind what they're trying to substantiate through those marketing efforts. And like surely that's never going to do anyone the service that they need. So I'm 100% with you on that. Let's fast track. I'd love to hear more about how on earth did this collaboration, this book with Alex come about? And I'm also really interested, and you kind of alluded to it here, about trying to figure out how to decide what goes in, because you've come with a whole body of experience and knowledge and wealth of, examples, and Alex does as well. And I'm really interested to hear about how that kind of dynamic worked. So how did it come about? And how on earth did you decide what to keep in and what to keep out?
Yeah, I think I first met Alex. I first met Alex. It was virtually, I think, because Business Model Generation came out. I've been following his work, and it was very complementary to a lot of stuff that Eric Ries was doing at a time that I was following as well. And I went to his masterclass in San Francisco. It was at Fort Mason. It was way back. It might have been 2011. I don't remember exactly when it was, 2012 maybe. And I was just really we finally met in person, and we've been corresponding online, or I think maybe had Skype calls or something like that. And I was really interested in injecting the testing aspect of what he was kind of crafting. I feel like his superpower is strategy and everything that he's amazing at, and visual management styles and everything. And we just kind of kept talking together. We kept talking. We didn't really lose out of touch. We weren't actively collaborating, but we were, we still kept pinging each other on stuff and bounce ideas off each other. And then I think it was around 2015 or so, we actually started more doing collaboration. And pretty quickly he reached out to me and said, you should write a book. And I'd already kind of failed at a couple. I'd put up landing pages and I was writing content and sharing with readers. And I felt like the kind of stuff I was trying to do was at the time really hard to break it down into testable chunks and test with readers. And I was doing a business novel thing, which made it really more hard. And so I was like, oh, you don't have to convince me. What should we do? And so at first it kind of you should write a book, and then it became we should work together on something, And eventually, as is my co-author, he really helped me understand how to write a book in a way that I've never seen visualized before or articulated to me, right? Because you look at these landscape style books and now they're everywhere. But back then, no one really wanted to take a shot on a full landscape style, full color print business book. That was kind of unheard of at the time. And now we just think, oh, that's what business books look like. And at the time, what Alex did was really, pretty risky. And so just to have him coach me, and also Alex, his partner Alan Smith was also on this, and just go through how we lay out the designs and everything. It was really an awesome experience to learn how to write that kind of style book, because I feel like some people have just copied it. They're like, oh, it's just full scale landscape. Hey, we'll just do that and sketch, and there's really a lot more behind the scenes of how you create a book in that format. And so. In a short story, it was just him reaching out to me, and we had kind of been thinking about, how to collaborate more, and it kind of manifested this way. And it wasn't really trying to win me over. It was pretty easy conversation to have. Oh, Alex wants to almost be my partner in this journey. Sure. That wasn't really something I thought I had to think really hard about.
Yeah, no, I love that you just one of the things that I've been so drawn to as well with all of these books, is how incredibly visual they are, but how accessible I think most of the tools and most of the whole thing actually really seems on first. And I think actually there's I'll get to the question in a minute, but something that's been going through my head for quite a while, and I'm interested to hear your reaction to this as well, your thoughts on it, is that all the Strategyzer books, yourself, your own included, seem on the first instance to be incredibly simplistic, maybe even. Some of the aspects, some of the examples, some of the tools just seem so easy to do. But I think there's this really, maybe it's not strange, maybe it's a normal learning curve of where you kind of, you get into it and you go, okay, I get this. I get these things. I'm going to use these tools. This all makes sense to me. And then suddenly you get into more depth and you go, whoa, this is way more complex, way more challenging, far more difficult than I thought. And then some people, it's almost like this inflection point where some people go, that's not the thing for me. And maybe other people go, this, I want to push through. I'm going to push through and kind of learn this and get to, deeper depths, whatever it is, and continue to learn. And I feel like I'm still really on that journey towards mastery, if you like, of understanding how and when to use these different tools and how it all kind of pieces together. But like, I can imagine the process of writing that. You would have had so much complexity with each of these things, and knowing how to make it simple, that just is an absolute mastery for me in like the art and the science of bringing something together that just makes sense. So I think like amazing. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on whether that's intentional, that kind of journey of like it seeming accessible, and then the more you go into it, the more depth there seems to be. And whether that kind of process was how I kind of explained it there, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I still refer people back to the Business Model Generation book, and I still go back to it, and I think that's a testament to how it is written and designed and presented, right? And so you think of a canvas, and you're like, okay, well, it's kind of like a checklist. I just do this, 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 and this, and I'm good. And then you realize, oh no, it's not. It's more about the relationship between the things. And then, oh, here's what if I change this part? What does it do over here? And then it's like, oh, but your business doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a whole environment around it. So what are the strengths and weaknesses and macroeconomic factors and everything? And Alex and I kind of joke sometimes because it's like, I wasn't personally involved in that book, but it's still really influential in my career. And I was like, people never made it to the back of that book, did they? Like, because there's all this environment stuff. And I still have people come to me and like, oh, well, where do I put competitors? It's like, dude, it's part of the environment. Like, did you ever get that far? And they're like, no, of course. Yeah. And so I still refer even back to the first book, even today in my culture, in my coaching and consulting. And so I feel as if, when I went through this process, and I've given some talks about it and written some stuff about it, but when you start with a book like this, it's like we started with sticky notes. And I know that sounds really cliche, but that's kind of where we started, and mapping the book out. And then we go to sketches and we hand draw, what this spread could look like. And things I learned from Alex there were things like, what's the weight of the page or the spread? You don't want a big heavy concept on one side and a very light concept on the other, and have the spread imbalanced. And I would have thought of that. I would have just started drawing and putting stuff. And I have a design background, and I still would have struggled with that. But the idea of the spreads and the balance and what you convey when the pages are open together, that's a whole thinking process you have to go through and refine it over time. And then we went to past sketches. We would go to I'd draw something a little more higher fidelity, or I'd go into Keynote. It's pretty crazy, by the way. I wrote most of this book in Keynote. I don't think many people would do that. And so at some point, I'm like, full scale, like full landscape and color, and why don't I just do this in Keynote? And so obviously we translated stuff into Adobe before we went to the press, to publisher. But a lot of those, like the next level of fidelity for me was like laying it out in Keynote, right? And then and then putting illustrations. And so we did things like, we had a professional illustrator, Owen Pomeroy, out of the UK, hand draw each experiment. And there were cases where I would say, hey, can you just come up with something cool here, and not give him a lot of info? And then other times I would say, can you draw this specific scene? And he would draw it that way. And then I would get it, and I would make a video of it, me talking through it, what I liked and didn't, feedback and all that, and then send it back to him, and then he'd send another version. And it was just like this really interesting process of, can we make it accessible, but also have some depth, so it's something that's more of a mainstay. But it was a really interesting process to write a book with Alex. It was like unlike what I thought writing a book would be like.
Yeah, how amazing. I love that. And I think you've absolutely succeeded on something which is accessible, it's simplistic, it's simple on first viewing, and you can go to new depths constantly. I exactly find like you have, I can flick to any one of these pages, any one of these books, and any page, and I'm pretty certain that I'll read something that sparks a new thought about that concept or that idea. I'll learn something constantly with every kind of new page flick, if you like, throughout all of these books. So amazing work. Let's fast forward a little bit, if that's okay. I'm interested to hear about, now what's going on with you now, and I'm particularly one of the questions that we've spoken about previously, and we never got to. I never found out an answer, and I'm interested to know whether you're willing to share this. I'd really love to hear your simple approach to innovating. How do you explain what your process to innovation is?
I was really challenged by this last fall, working with public relations and PR and people, storytellers, outside my expertise. And really, if you take it down to a 3-step process, it's extract your assumptions, map them, and run experiments. And so that, if you had to boil everything I do down to 3 steps, I'm getting people to talk about what they're worried about. And usually I'm framing that desirable, viable, feasible, sometimes adaptable, or other things that are thrown in there. But basically the 3: do people want this? Should we be working on this? And can we do this? And it doesn't matter what industry I work with, they have to really address risk in all 3, whether doing something in space, on the moon, on the space station, which is stuff I've been around at Singularity University, or if it's some kind of like B2C cat sharing app, which is like a very Valley thing, or if I'm working with like a B2B chemical company, they still have to figure out the risk around those 3. And so usually it's all jumbled up inside their heads. And what I try to do is get them to write these down, usually as a team. And then the mapping is like, how do we prioritize? And that's where assumptions mapping comes in, which is what are the most important things where we know the least amount about them, least amount of evidence. And then I had to focus and like, okay, well, if this stuff is wrong, we're really in trouble. This other stuff is important, but maybe here, if this is wrong, like this whole thing's doomed. And then it's how do we run experiments to address that stuff? And so part of the book, a big chunk of the book, is all those experiments and the taxonomy and, desirable experiments, feasible, viable, and then cost and all that stuff that we've put in there. But I'm really just trying to facilitate a structured conversation of what are you worried about? Let's focus and let's give you options to go and drive, let's drive that into action and come back and learn. And so if you try to distill it down, that's really the 3-step process: extract, map, and then run experiments, and keep doing that until you can de-risk and figure out, is this worth investing in?
Yeah, and I love experiments, multiple. So often when we first start mentioning the word experiments with clients that I've been working with, they kind of think of a one-off thing, and I think we've probably fallen foul of this over the last few years of thinking we do one prototype, we do one MVP, we do one thing, and then that's our experiment. After that, we go ahead, build and launch. And of course, they couldn't be further from the truth of what we really need. There's constant experimentation, I think, is the thing that we really need to have, and way beyond, getting to a point of launch or being successful in something being successful in market. There has to then continue to be experiments, whether they be around growth or whatever it is, as well. And I think that mindset of experimentation is something that is so important and so seldom seen outside of perhaps a startup entrepreneurial world. Definitely very hard to see that in the kind of enterprise space, I think.
Yeah, I have a really large multi-billion-dollar company as a client in San Francisco, and a few years ago they had new leadership come in from another company that really embraced experimentation. And the first question he asked, I remember, was, "How many experiments are you running across the company?" They're like, "Well, we're running one A/B test." This is a multi-billion-dollar company, like it's been around for decades, and they're like, yeah, that's not gonna cut it. We're gonna have to think through what are some other things we can do. And I have to say, I do use experimentation pretty broadly. I know you can throw a lot of this stuff under research or under other different categories, but personally, and maybe I'm biased here, I like it under the umbrella of experimentation because we can tie it back to risk. We can say, what's the hypothesis we're trying to test? Right. And then, a lot of these experiments we have under that umbrella, it's like, oh, well, this gives us options to do stuff. And then are we supporting that or refuting it? It's not always binary, but I really try to use that as kind of like my wedge to get people thinking through. It's not just a series of steps we follow and then we're successful. It's, hey, what did we learn? Oh, what would that change about what we're doing? And I really try to get that loop going. But you're right, it's more than one experiment. You never want to just run one. Usually it's multiple over time.
And actually, to your point of this three-step sequence, it absolutely isn't a linear thing that you do once. It's, once you've got some validation, you come back, you circle back to those assumptions, remap maybe some of those post-its, if you like, on the assumption map of you've got a bit more evidence for it. It can shift left a little. You can maybe it seems less important now because something else is taking its place, and so constantly coming back to those things as a working document rather than a one-off, I think, is super important as well. I was going to ask actually for a more concrete example, but the picture you've painted of this enormous company starting to adopt some of these approaches is great. Is there anything like specific that they did, do you think, to start to build? Because culture change is so hard. Behavior change from an individual perspective is so hard. From a big organization, multi-billion-dollar organization, changing behaviors, so rarely really works. What are some of the things I think that you've seen work, perhaps in that company or perhaps other things, about trying to get people to understand this mindset of experimentation and start to apply that as well?
Yeah, it really comes. A lot of it's with leadership. It's more about how they model behavior and how they, not just what they say, but what they do. And so I have this, and sometimes I do this in the master class as well, where I kind of lay out, like, think about the last time you were in front of a leader in your company and you were presenting something to them or having a conversation with them. Like, what were the words they used and how did they behave? And so I feel like there's this negative connotation with accountability. Right, we talk about being held accountable in a lot of these organizations, where I'm held accountable by releasing features on this date and staying under budget and all that. And there's another model of accountability, which is like the ability to give an account, like to give an account of how you're making progress, how you're de-risking something. And so when I'm working with leaders, it's a lot of, what are the words we're using? Is it all first person? Like I did this, or I think you should do this, or I think you should run that experiment. Like, that's not going to build a culture of experimentation and learning inside your company. It's more about, what do you think we should do? And how would you get there? And what are your ideas? And what are the risks? And so it's more not always leading with answers, but it's more leading with questions. And then can you create an environment where people can work this way? Because it does take time. But what I see so often is we want to adopt all the tools, but then we're using the same kind of leadership style where we're saying, run that experiment, or I think you should do this, or I think you should persevere. And it should be more of a conversation where the teams are working through that uncertainty and presenting, and then having a conversation whether you should invest, versus the leader trying to, I feel like sometimes it's not even the leaders being aware that they're doing this. They're trying to give them the benefit of their opinion and their knowledge. But what happens are the teams take those as marching orders. So if you're kind of coming back and you're saying, here's the information we've gathered from our experiments on this new idea we're working on, and it's not landing well, we don't actually think we should invest in this. And then when you have the leader go, but I still think that's a good idea, that one sentence can unravel months or potentially years worth of effort, because they're saying,
Right.
why am I going and doing all this work when, if you just think it's a good idea, I'm just going to do what you want, And so I think so much of it is getting leadership coaching at a board level, at the C level, to learn how to not just say the words of, I want to build a culture of experimentation, learning, and all this, but the actions and how to really enable that. Because I think that's the most impactful thing leaders can do in these companies, is create a safe environment where people can learn. And it requires a level of trust that's more than surface level. I'm holding you accountable to doing task level of trust. It's got to be deeper than that. Like, I trust you to kind of work through this uncertainty, and it's a little messy, and give me an account of how we're making progress and should we invest. And so that is where I'm drawn to recently. It is more about helping leaders understand that, because it's amazing to me at the tool and the team level, like, they're going to get it, but leadership can unravel that work even unknowingly by just trying to give the benefit of their opinion and realizing it's marching orders that completely unravel the whole need for testing whatsoever.
Yeah, and it reminds me of the kind of mastery, autonomy, and purpose kind of triad of what people are looking for in their work. They want that autonomy, that freedom to be able to explore, to experiment, to figure things out for themselves rather than be told. The granularity of what they want to, what should be, how things should be done. Figuring out their methods, their approaches, I think is really important. That sense of purpose in the bigger picture and understanding where we're going, and that comes down to so much communication. And I think you're right. Just those changes in language, rather than I think this, it's what do you think? It's a classic coaching kind of response and relationship. So I think that's. I wish more people were able to kind of see this from a leadership perspective, but and embrace this and really kind of throw their that trust wide open for their staff. I think the world would be a better place.
As well. And I do think there's some progress being made, right? You hear more about psychological safety in the workplace, which 5-10 years ago, I didn't hear much at all. I hear things about, having a moral compass when you're making product decisions more at these big product conferences. I hear things like the language of experimentation, lean startup permeating these industries to an extent. When I go to a conference and I hear people say, and this was my riskiest assumption, I'm like, yes. They're not saying lean startup, right? They're not saying like design thinking, but they're using a lot of that underlying, here are the things we're doing to test this big thing, and this is how it worked, and this is how it didn't. And I think we just need many, many more of those stories. And as I always try to convince my clients to go speak and publicize what they're working on, because people are really interested in that, or at least I am anyway. And I think it could be a recruiting tool for them if they can share some of those stories. So I am hopeful that we are making some headway with this.
I think so as well. And I think we can get wrapped up in this bubble, can't we, quite often, of like, we've been in this world for a long time. Surely everyone is thinking this. And sometimes you just need to kind of pop your head out every now and again and go, you know what? There's still a lot of work to do over here. And sometimes it becomes very stark, that realization, when you hit a new client or whatever it is, and doing some new work with somebody else. And they're a long way off, but it's all about kind of coaching them and bringing them on that journey as well. I'm really interested, actually, because one of the things that you mentioned earlier was having worked in those 3 startups early on, and then kind of more recent work, I think, would be much more around the corporate enterprise space. What's the difference that you've seen, that you've kind of experienced about innovation in those 2 different worlds? And I ask this question as someone personally who also works in those spaces quite often. I seem to be have that weird juxtaposition, or that, like, 1 minute I'm working with enormous infrastructure companies that, European, whatever, taking over. And then the next minute I'm literally working with a 1-person, 2-person startup to help them kind of figure things out. What differences have you seen about those 2 different worlds?
It's the only way I can keep my sanity. I don't know if this is how you feel, is that I do think there's a lot of overlap as far as how you think through things and some of the tools. Because I still work with a lot of startups. It's not the majority of my revenue, but I love startups, and eventually I want to raise a fund where we fund startups working this way. And so when I work with corporates, I understand that world too. Personally, I've been a part of startups that were acquired by big companies, and I've been at big companies when they acquired startups. So I've seen kind of both views, so I can empathize. And it's really interesting to me with the principles are pretty much the same that I try to stick with, as far as how do you test and all that. The practices, in a way, there's some interesting things that come out. So one, startups are like, oh, I can't put this out because it'll damage my brand. I was like, nobody even knows your brand. Nobody cares about your brand. You're probably going to change your company. Like, any really successful company I look at now had a different name. Almost, like, a lot of them had a different name. Like DoorDash was like Palo Alto Delivery Service, right? And I forget what Ring was. It was some weird door thing. Like, you give too much emphasis to your brand as a startup, and you don't have a brand yet. Nobody knows who you are. But when I go into big companies, some of their brands have been in existence over 100 years. And so it's a very real fear there where, oh, we put something out, and then someone from CNET or somewhere blogs on it, or TechCrunch, and then we use damage control on whether or not like this new thing we're working on got leaked out. And so there, I try to alleviate some of that. It's like, let's work with legal. Can we spin up like like a labs brand or something where we can do something slightly off-branded and still be, have it be legal and everything, but not just put our logo front and center of everything. The other things I see in big companies, you have all the resources in the world. It's just more, can you leverage them? Sometimes like, oh, we'll just use this channel to get to the segment, and then you go work with the people in that channel, and they're like, no, I don't want to use this channel for this. like we're not gonna let you do that. and then at small startups, it's almost like you have no resources, so you have to be super scrappy. And so the juxtaposition is really, really interesting to me. But I thoroughly enjoy working with both, and even with big companies, it's really fun to see like the scale of impact you can have. I've been working with one client for over a year, and I've trained hundreds of people and helping them like make investment decisions on these giant, opportunities where they're trying to align to UN guidelines of environmental policy and everything. And yet, when I go to a startup, it's like, I never know where this is going to go. Like, it could be a giant thing someday, or it could go away, but it's really fun to get in front of hungry entrepreneurs who just don't have the resources, and they're trying to figure out what can they do with what they have. So I feel the principles are very, very similar. I feel like brand is a very big distinction between the two. And then resources. Startups have almost none. And then big companies have all these resources, but then you can't just take for granted the fact that you can use them. And so it's really coming back to navigating a lot of that. So yeah, but I really enjoy working with both.
It's so good to hear. I absolutely agree, and like it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. Is how do I change my practice depending on this kind of arbitrary thing about size, right? It's not about size, but I think it is about brand. I think you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head there, and I think it is about, of course, it's about resource as well. And I think there are people within some of these big organizations, hopefully high up as well, and we're seeing that much more, who are entrepreneurial. They are startup leaders in a different form, in a different surrounding. And I think what I've seen is identifying those individuals that have are given a little bit of a leash. They're given a bit of free rein to go and explore, and then seeing what business model innovation or product innovation they can come up with is a fascinating thing to be able to see and witness. So I think it's I totally agree, and I don't think. Yeah, I mean, there's a difference for sure, but I think the principles remain the same, which is great, super cool.
Yeah, I was probably one of the first to really push like lean startup for bigger companies. And I remember giving this talk in San Francisco. It's like lean startup in the enterprise, and people were like, "You're crazy! Like, why would you ever try that?" I mean, I was getting a lot of pushback from people, and these are people I really respected, were like really expert opinions, and I was like, no, I think it can work. And interesting enough, I would almost argue that, I mean, it's changing, but I would argue that it's landed better with big companies than it has with startups to an extent. I think big companies really see it as a way to innovate, and they don't like the branding that much, but they like the techniques and the tools and the thinking and all that. And then, oddly enough, I don't really think Silicon Valley is really embracing it or have embraced, because even though it kind of originated there, and there's all these thought leaders and everything. I hate saying thought leaders, but there are all these people that are like evangelizing and everything. But you look at how it behaves in the Valley and funding, it's not really like base hit level funding to get. It's all these like go big or go home unicorn kind of stuff for the most part. And then, but I travel other parts of the world. I find that the people that are bootstrapping really, really appreciate it, and they really get it, and they know that they have limited resources, and they want to go and test their way through it. And so I would argue that the whole like lean startup movement has impacted big companies to an extent, like across the world, and also bootstrapped founders outside of the Valley more than it really has influenced funding and behavior inside the Valley, which is kind of weird, because you would think maybe it's like not like, I don't know, it's kind of like profit in your own backyard kind of thing, where maybe it's like it's invented here, so therefore we're not going to use it, or it's already hyped out or something. But I find that when I travel abroad, it's really cool to see people not taking early stage funding and just like using these techniques to build up something, and then they ask for funding when they need to scale. I just think that's really awesome.
Yeah, and I see that a lot more in London and the UK. I think actually lean. I was in a kind of a venture studio factory thing as a startup. I had a startup, and lean was like, that was the approach that they were kind of pushing and coaching you towards. in all of its kind of facets. And I think in probably over here it is more widely spread across the kind of startup world, and even the kind of venture seeking startups as well. I probably seem to be using it a bit more than perhaps you're seeing. And definitely it's one of those staples now on kind of entrepreneurship programs within the universities and kind of other courses like that as well. So yeah, definitely, it's definitely still there, I think. I'm going to switch up a little bit. I would love to hear the story about your incredible LinkedIn meme game. Like, it is up there beyond anything else I'm seeing. It's amazing because LinkedIn is so dry at times, but I think I think we've talked about this previously. I think it is such an opportunity there for content rather than just about networking. I think content is an amazing opportunity with LinkedIn. But you are seem to be smashing it with the meme game. Tell me about it. How did it start? Why do you do it? How do you do it?
Yeah, I've always been kind of I don't want to say class clown, but I was always like in school, I was this really smart kid that tried to make people laugh, and I was kind of more sarcastic kind of sense of humor, and didn't always work out for me, believe me. Through my years, like facilitation, I tried to take all that out, so it was really hard for me to facilitate and work in jokes, because then people are like, what? And then you just wreck the whole session, or you say something you think it's funny and it offends somebody. And it's really been hard for me. So over the years, I've really worked on being just kind of trying to take it out of my facilitation to an extent, or I do lighthearted humor that isn't going to wreck the whole session. And when I'm online, everything's so dry. It's very like this hustle culture, and everything is so serious. And especially when the pandemic was hitting, I was already starting to change my style a bit. So the product death cycle, which was literally out of a coaching session with this really big known company in San Francisco, I was so frustrated by this idea of just asking people what they wanted and building it and thinking that was going to work out. And I just drew this. It probably took me like 3 minutes to draw. It's not a very good drawing. And, then people started writing essays on it. It's been in Inc. magazine. It's been in books. Andrew Chin wrote an essay on it, and it's kind of out there now. But it's like this moment where I try to really speak to the challenges I'm seeing, but in a way that's kind of lighthearted, but also makes you think. And you're like, oh, I've lived that. Like, I've built stuff people asked for and it didn't work out. And so with LinkedIn, I was like, well, let me just try let me try that kind of style and see what happens. Like one line to kind of make you think, or funny, or like laugh, and then either a picture or a video. And it's injected a lot of, like, I think, humor into it all, because everything LinkedIn, it's changing a bit, but it's still very like buttoned up, kind of stodgy in a way platform of like, let me introduce you to this person, and let's and I was like, wow, these people take things way too seriously, So it's like, can I educate people but also make them laugh? And that's kind of where I'm at. And I kind of different formats. Sometimes they're videos, sometimes they're pictures, sometimes they're other things. And I made this poll, which was just really silly. I was just like, how many chuggas before the choo-choo on LinkedIn? And I made it a poll, and it just took off. People were sharing it on other platforms, and then they were complaining that it was an interview question. That was a really unfair interview question to ask somebody how many chuggas are before the choo-choo. I would love to know if that's like people really did that. But I was just trying to get people to kind of just like take a break and not take themselves so seriously on LinkedIn. So it's worked out really well. I mean, I've had millions of views on these posts. I think we're still working out like LinkedIn's kind of weird. It's not like YouTube, right? Where you have millions of views and then you can kind of monetize that. With LinkedIn, it's a bit different. But right now I'm just using it to kind of just like, I laugh at it and then I post it, and I'm hoping other people laugh too. And I try to teach people. So I kind of have some rules, it's like usually one sentence or two sentences and not more than 15 seconds of video. If I use a video, I feel like their attention span's gone after 15 seconds. And I try not to put anything too mean-spirited out there, right? I know I don't want to be taken the wrong way. But yeah, I just try to have fun with it and try to educate, plus, make people laugh. And I try to keep it really, really simple.
It's fantastic. I love it. It definitely makes me laugh. So it's succeeding at a sample size of one at least. But I know it's succeeding a lot more widely than that as well. One of the frustrations, and I would love LinkedIn to be able to do something about this, is I'd love to see some of them kind of come back, or like more easily be able to search through kind of some of that content if they considered themselves to be more of a content tool where people can discover content and rediscover, I think that would be a really interesting thing. And maybe they've got some of the things right, but I think there's a bunch of stuff that could do with a little bit of work, I think.
Yeah, like here's a good example. So I did this meme on experiments, buying experiments. So I did this little like table, and I had different experiments at different price points. And I say, hey, if you have $5, what would you build out as an experiment sequence, or $15? I forget the amount. And it was really wildly popular. And I was like, oh, you know what? I should go find that and like make it a featured post on my LinkedIn, because I'm still trying to work on my branding and all that. And I couldn't find it. Like I literally searched. I mean, my feed's a mess, right? Because I do like memes every other day. And so I was like, oh, I don't even know when I posted that. And I started searching, and I found it as like either other people had taken it and posted it and credited me, or they reshared it. But I couldn't actually find the actual post from me. And I was scrolling through the app, and like it got to the point where it just stopped scrolling. And I was like, I've been scrolling for 10 minutes and I didn't find it. And then I'm about to go back on the desktop, like Chrome, version of it and try to find. But I think the feature on profile LinkedIn, it kind of reminds me of, pinned tweets on Twitter to an extent. That is okay, but then it's not amazing. Yeah, it's really, really interesting where they're going to take the platform. I feel like and people's work-life balance has changed over this pandemic, and they're using LinkedIn for a very more personal way too. And I think that has to impact the strategy. But yeah, there's some stuff that's a little wonky that I feel as if I can't even find my own content on there. So I know other people aren't finding it. So I think they have a ways to go.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. We've talked a bunch about your approaches, what you're doing, how you're working with big and small organizations, but what have we missed out? What from your experience and journey would you like people to know? Is there anything that you think we haven't quite covered off?
I feel as if you boil it down to a personal level with me. I myself struggle with like high degree of uncertainty, and so I've kind of built ways to address it and manage it, right? And so I think why I'm drawn to helping people manage it is like, in a way, it's kind of helping me at the same time, because I really have a hard time with it. And it's childhood issues and everything else that's happened in my life. But at a really personal level, I feel as if it's why I'm so drawn to this and really passionate about it, is that if I can help other people deal with uncertainty, then maybe I can help myself get a little better at it as well. And so I just wouldn't discount that. If you're like really passionate about something and you're really struggling with something internally, like one way to go about it is to help others, and then therefore you can kind of maybe help yourself in a way. So that's something I would stress. And then as far as me, davidjbland.com is a really great way to find me. I'm on a lot of the social networks, but if you're looking for a hub, and I'm currently redesigning it, it's going to launch soon. That's a great place to learn more about me and what I'm doing, because there is a portfolio of things I do, and so, but they're all kind of have the same theme around dealing with uncertainty. And so, yeah, going to davidjblade.com is probably your best bet to see what I'm about.
Well, David, enormous thanks. We've covered a lot of ground there. It's amazing to hear your journey come to life in that way. So huge thanks. I've been following for a while. There's a lot there that is new to me, that I've kind of learning, which is one of the main reasons that I'm doing this really is to learn and deepen my understanding, my own practice. And hopefully there's some people out there that are on a similar kind of wavelength and a similar journey themselves as well. So I'm sure there's a lot of takeaways that people are going to be able to take forward in their lives as well. So massive thanks on behalf of everyone for this, but also for this. And if anyone hasn't got this book, what on earth are you doing? This needs to be go and purchased. Stop listening now. Get onto Amazon or any other bookshop would do, and go and purchase Testing Business Ideas by David J. Bland and Alex Osterwalder. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.